So some people have asked me what I think of the Zeitgeist movement, hereafter referred to as TZM. So I thought I'd do a video essentially giving a critical assessment of TZM from a libertarian socialist perspective. So what is TZM? TZM describes itself as being a grassroots sustainability advocacy organisation which calls for the construction of a natural law resource-based economy. In the Zeitgeist movement defined, a natural law resource-based economy is described as being an adaptive socio-economic system actively derived from direct physical reference to the governing scientific laws of nature. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but to my understanding what it basically means is that we do an assessment of the needs of the human population, coupled with an assessment of the pool of resources that are available to us, and essentially design the economy to make ends meet so that human needs are met and resources are not wasted. According to Peter Joseph's introduction, a resource-based economy would be a steady state rather than a growth economy based on cooperation rather than competition, planning, the automation of as much labour as possible, the replacement of proprietarianism with universal free access to goods and services, and the abolition of currency, markets, and commercial exchange altogether. TZM also rejects the state apparatus and argues that the need for a state emerges with an inefficient economic system. I shall now begin my criticisms of TZM. My first criticism is that TZM's conception of what human needs are is necessary but not sufficient for a decent society. Now, of course, we have the material needs of food, water, shelter, and so on, and that's understandable to focus on that given that it's basically an economic project. However, we do have social needs as well that go outside of the economic sphere. We have a need to socialise, to play. We need to create a positive environment in which the community respects the individual and the individual respects the community. Now, these are serious human needs that need to be met that fall outside of the economic sphere. In his lecture Defining Peace, Peter Joseph talks about how bigotry isn't economically efficient because it leads to conflict and thus waste resources. However, what if, hypothetically, an extremely racist society somehow led to a very small increase in economic efficiency? Would it then be justified to have an extremely racist society? If the answer is no, then we can conclude that there are factors beyond the economic realm that ought to be taken into account when constructing a decent society. We don't just have material needs, but we have social needs as well, and TZM doesn't give adequate attention to this. My second criticism is that TZM does not give a coherent explanation of economic decision-making processes in a resource-based economy. In his introduction, Peter Joseph describes the need to move away from the dispersed corporate system to a planned system. However, what he means by this isn't made completely clear. Corporations tend to use central planning as a decision-making mechanism because employing a democratic process might end up with democratic control over pay, thus stopping the flow of money towards the owner. The capitalist system is dispersed in that it's run by different corporations competing with one another, but it's centrally planned in regards to the practices within those corporations. So when TZM calls for the replacement of a dispersed system with a planned system, it's not exactly clear what's being advocated. Within this context, it implies a centralised planning authority. However, in an interview with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, Peter Joseph suggests otherwise.
A real economy would take resources that we have and assess them for their scientific relevance, assess them for what they're actually supposed to do, what their highest efficacy is.
But who does the assessment?
The assessment is done by reason, and this is something that people hate it when I say it, because they think that somebody in some round table in some Soviet circle is going to make all the decisions for all the world.
This implies that there isn't going to be a centralised authority. After he talks about how great logic and reason is for a little bit, Peter Joseph then goes on to mention direct democracy.
We have to create a system of interaction of humanity where everyone decides. Now, what I mean by that is we have this thing called a direct democracy. It's very common now. It's used in technical circles. We apply the concept of direct democracy, except it isn't people seeing a referendum. It isn't people voting on something. It's actually about the true established element of society that keeps us going, which is industry itself, not politics.
What this implies is direct democratic control over industry, which anarcho-syndicalists and anarcho-communists have been working towards for quite a while. And of course this negates the idea of central planning. However, Peter doesn't make this clear, and instead he talks about how important it is that we need to use reason, to such an extent that it blurs the lines as to what he's actually advocating. This brings me to my third criticism of TZM. TZM advocates often portray TZM as though it transcends the political compass and that it's just science. I'm sorry, but this just isn't the case. TZM does advocate a rental system of strategic access. So we're basically going to have a big store of goods and services which we contribute to according to what we're able to, and we take from it according to what we need. Techno talk aside, if we just cut the crap, this is basically the commons. TZM also seems to express some kind of skepticism towards the idea of central planning. TZM defined states the following. Most economic debates today revolved around this duality on one level or another, with the laissez-faire interests, or those who wish to have a completely non-regulated market economy, constantly at war with the statists, or those who think some kind of centralised government control and decision-making over economic planning and policy is best. The Zeitgeist movement takes neither side, even though many who hear TZM's proposals have a knee-jerk reaction to assume the latter association. This position of both rejecting the state and the capitalist market basically places TZM on the libertarian left. However, TZM doesn't acknowledge that, primarily because it touts itself as merely being a scientific viewpoint rather than a political one. This, I believe, is to the detriment of TZM's goals because it separates it from other organisations on the libertarian left with shared concerns and objectives, such as the abolition of the state, capitalism, money, commercial exchange, to be replaced with a stateless, non-proprietarian society. Take a look at this quote from the Zeitgeist movement defined, for example. The slavery today overall takes the less severe form of wage labour in the larger context of class associations as determined by one's place in the economic hierarchy. This is basically flirting with the idea of wage slavery, which has been talked about by socialists for a very long time. The Industrial Workers of the World, for example, is an anti-capitalist labour union which draws upon left libertarian strategies such as direct action. The IWW is over 100 years old and it campaigns for the abolition of the wage system, regarding it as a form of enslavement.
Welcome to the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day March Against Wage Slavery. Every year we march on MLK Day, and we do that to honor Dr. King's legacy. He was a fighter for social justice, he believed in freedom for all people, and he believed in an end to all forms of slavery. Today, we're marching against wage slavery. Now, what's wage slavery? Well, wage slavery is when you work every day to make your workplace successful, but somebody else is always reaping the benefits of your hard work. And wage slavery is when you have to stay in a job that you hate because it's a matter of survival. And some people say, if your job is bad, why don't you quit? But we know quitting changes nothing, so we say in the IWW, if your job is bad, then why don't you organize?
Yeah! Wage labour essentially constitutes an authoritarian social relationship between the owners and the workers. And if TZM wants to see an end to that, which I think they do, then they should be seeking to join labour unions which take action against wage slavery. As an individual worker, you don't have much power against the system that's destroying humanity. But when you're together in a union with others, you do have far more strength. And so left-wing anarchists have this concept, this weapon, against the domination of the capitalist system of workers' solidarity, which advocates of TZM should learn from if they're genuinely interested in social change.
So, rather than debate about who should be the next president, why don't we step back and consider some broader issues, such as, I don't know, maybe why we even have a president to begin with? What is this, medieval feudalism? I thought the days of kings, dictators, and giving one person enormous power was coming to an end.
To return to the issue of decision-making, which I don't think Peter Joseph made clear enough, the libertarian left has been campaigning against the centralisation of decision-making powers in the hands of state and private sector elites for a very long time. Instead, we favour direct democracy, in which participants in a given activity get to control that activity through their own rational deliberation and foster cooperation and solidarity with others, rather than the law of the jungle, the state of ruthless competition that so many people falsely associate with anarchism, even though it's a textbook feature of capitalist societies. Although TZM does mention direct democracy, it fails to address the risk of creating a centralised authority of scientists, technocrats and so on, who essentially run things in their own interests and become the new ownership class. We are educated in preparation for the corporate division of labour, which creates inequalities between those who do the empowering work and those who do the disempowering work, the coordinator class and the working class. Thus, if we don't want to end up back where we started, we have to get rid of that distinction. Now, some people think this is too difficult, but it is possible. In the 2001 economic crisis in Argentina, workers occupied and took over the factories in order to prevent corporations from shutting them down. Now, some people found that the work was still just as miserable and alienating as it was under the corporate system, precisely because they kept this division of labour between the coordinator class and the working class. Now, to solve that problem, they decided to essentially share the empowering work and create balanced job complexes, which had some success. There were workers taking part in the managing of finances who, 1 or 2 years beforehand, weren't able to read. During the anarchist revolution in Spain, in the broad effort to improve the lives of the working class, rationalist schools were set up in order to push up literacy rates, which were previously quite low, which again addresses this same problem. Advocates of a resource-based economy should understand the need for horizontal decision-making practices so that we don't end up with this bureaucratic Soviet circle, as Peter Joseph described it. The lack of discussion in TZM surrounding this issue, I believe, stems from the same point that I mentioned earlier. They don't have an assessment of social needs to complement their assessment of material needs. When compared with TZM's perspective of meeting human needs as much as possible to the extent that it doesn't deplete resources, anarcho-communists have a very similar conception of what an economy should be. Peter Kropotkin states in The Conquest of Bread that the study of political economy should be the study of the needs of mankind and the means of satisfying them with the least possible waste of human energy. That's remarkably similar. Peter Kropotkin was also a scientist. When he was living in exile in England, he wrote a book called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, which was published in 1902. Now, a lot of people claim that we have this natural predisposition towards extreme competition. Hobbes was saying that our state of nature is to constantly be at each other's throats all the time. Mutual aid argues that, in fact, cooperation is perfectly natural, especially among more intelligent forms of life, including ourselves, and that the idea that we must constantly be put at each other's throats in order to be productive is both irrational and dangerous. Kropotkin also supported the use of science and technology to help solve problems, for example stating in Ethics that development of the industrial technique at last gives man the opportunity to free himself from slavish toil. He also held the view that an economic system designed to meet human needs would drive technological innovation, in order to automate the jobs which are menial but necessary for our survival. Post-Scarcity Anarchism is a collection of essays by Murray Bookchin, which talks about the liberating potential of new technology from an anti-capitalist perspective. He says, "Men do not remove their ties of bondage and become fully human merely by divesting themselves of social domination and obtaining freedom in its abstract form. They must also be free concretely, free from material want, from toil, from the burden of devoting the greater part of their time, indeed the greater part of their lives, to the struggle with necessity." Murray Bookchin also developed a critical social theory known as social ecology, which understands anti-ecological trends and environmental destruction as being rooted in our political, social and economic structures. I highly recommend that TZM advocates look into the work of Peter Kropotkin and Murray Bookchin, and perhaps the goals of the libertarian left in general, because TZM is a left libertarian position. They just don't seem to realise it.
Differences and similarities between the Zeitgeist movement and anarchism as a movement, as an ideology?
You mean, well, there's a number of different schools of anarchism. You mean communist anarchist? You mean capitalist anarchist? You mean anarchist?
The anarchist, let's say.
I have no idea what the anarchist actually is.
Anarchist is essentially another word for social anarchist. Capitalist anarchist, on the other hand, is just a contradiction. TZM needs to acknowledge its relation to, if not its place within, left libertarian thought, if it's to make any progress and achieve its stated goals. In TZM defined, it is acknowledged that taking state power is an ineffective means of achieving positive social change. Quote, TZM sees the materialization of a new socio-economic model happening with the needed consensus of the population. Its very understanding, along with the biosocial pressures occurring as the current system worsens, is the basis of influence. The logic does not support a dictatorial disposition because that approach, apart from being inhumane, wouldn't work. In order for such a system to work, it needs to be accepted without active state coercion. Therefore, it is an issue of investigation, education, and broad personal acceptance in the community. In fact, the very specifics of social interaction and lifestyle actually demand a vast majority acceptance of the system's mechanics and values. While I agree that taking state power isn't a good strategy for achieving a more humane society, there is a crucial problem which TZM misses here: capital expropriation. Here's another quote from TZM Defined regarding the inherent antagonism between capital and labour. Founding free market economist David Ricardo's statement that if wages should rise then profits would necessarily fall is a simple acknowledgement of the structural assurance of class conflict as the wage relates to the lower working class and the profits the upper capitalist class, and as one gains, the other loses. Now, this is another idea which has been talked about by socialists for a very long time, and understanding that inherent antagonism is crucial to understanding how to get rid of capitalism. Yes, we must build up popular support. It must be a democratic movement. However, that in itself still isn't enough. In order to get rid of capitalism, it requires that the means of production be expropriated from the capitalist class and the state into the hands of the population by the organised working class and peasantry, through a revolutionary general strike, for example, if we're not going to take state power. To quote Lucy Parsons, "Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth." The likelihood of the wealthy classes voluntarily giving up all of their wealth to the rest of humanity is extremely small. To refuse to use force in an instance where everyone wants to have some kind of social change is to allow the capitalist class and the state a permanent veto on the emancipation of the great majority of humanity. If it wants to be successful, TZM is going to have to acknowledge its position on the libertarian left of the political compass, draw on the strategies of other left libertarian movements, such as industrial action, for example, and understand their historical relevance. George Orwell, in Homage to Catalonia, described his experiences in the Spanish Revolution in the late 1930s, in which, through tireless activism and industrial action, the people managed to create a more humane world, where the logic of capitalism no longer applied. Up here in Aragon, one was among tens of thousands of people, mainly though not entirely all of working class origin, all living at the same level and mingling on terms of equality. In theory, it was perfect equality, and even in practice, it was not far from it. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. There was no unemployment, and the price of living was still extremely low. You saw very few conspicuously destitute people, and no beggars except the gypsies. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings, and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. TZM advocates, if you're serious about creating a world beyond capitalism, which I believe you are, then please, I implore you to look into the Spanish Revolution the second that this video finishes, because it is inspiring, and you won't be disappointed.